I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. We appreciate you taking time off your busy schedule to join us. We have lots of participants today and hope you will learn a lot on COVID-19 vaccine today. To begin the program, I'd like to touch upon about JICA COVID-19 Webinar Series. To overcome COVID-19 pandemic challenges, JICA is taking a holistic approach by focusing on prevention, precaution, and treatment. Through this approach, we hope to contribute to protection of people's lives as the urgent target and build more resilient society. JICA recognizes that it's imperative to continuously share the latest scientific research findings, as well as practical knowledge and experience gained in the practice. The webinar is to invite distinguished Japanese researchers and clinicians to share the latest knowledge and experience in their respective fields, and to promote each country's effort to protect people's lives from COVID-19. In the seventh webinar of today, the topic is COVID-19 vaccine. Safe and effective vaccines are critical to end the COVID-19 pandemic. New types of vaccine have been developed for COVID-19, and already 7 vaccines were approved by WHO for emergency use. Almost all the countries have started vaccination program. However, we have lots of unknowns on vaccines themselves. And at the same time, we, especially health professionals, are struggling with overabundance of information and infodemic. So today, we decided to take the COVID-19 vaccine as the topic. Today, we will invite 2 speakers. First speaker, Mr. Kubokura Ken, will explain JICA's cooperation related to COVID-19 vaccines briefly. And second speaker is the main speaker, Professor Nakayama. He is a specialist expert on virology and vaccinatory. After the 2 presentations, we will have Q&A sessions for answering participants' questions. So let's start the presentation. Please allow me to welcome Mr. Kubokura Ken, Director, Office for COVID-19 Response, Human Development Department of JICA, to give his presentation on JICA's cooperation for the dissemination of COVID-19 vaccines. Welcome, Mr. Kubokura-san. Floor is yours.
Hello, good evening. This is Ken Kubokura. Makimo-san, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, let me briefly explain to you about JICA's initiative for global health and medicine, especially focusing on prevention through the COVID-19 vaccine in developing countries. Asian countries as well as African nations had managed the COVID-19 crisis relatively well before, but with the recent spread of the Delta variant, those countries are facing a steep surge of COVID-19 cases. In Japan, we are now in the 5th COVID-19 wave. Currently, nearly 30% of the Japanese population have been fully vaccinated, along with the recent effort of a vaccine rollout before the Tokyo Olympic Games. However, the rate is still behind many other countries, so that the progress of vaccine development and deployment has been drawing much more attention from the Japanese public than ever before. To protect people's lives and health, JICA has been taking a holistic approach focusing on prevention, precaution, and treatment under our initiative called JICA's Initiative for Global Health and Medicine. Prevention is a key to stop the COVID-19 pandemic. As one of the most effective preventive measures, speeding up and scaling up of vaccine delivery have been long awaited by every country and people. This June, Japan hosted the COVAX Vaccine Online Summit, having pledged additional 800 million US dollar on top of previous offer of 200 million. The Japan's Prime Minister also said that the country will provide 30 million domestically produced doses to other countries. JICA, working through global coordinating mechanisms such as the COVAX facility, will promote to establish effective and safe vaccination systems against COVID-19, including quality vaccine transportation and storage systems. For example, JICA is supporting the provision of cold chain equipment through the implementation of its grant aid projects in 7 countries in Asia, Africa, and Middle East. The agency is also implementing technical cooperation projects for COVID-19 response in order to strengthen cold chain systems through provision of equipment and trainings for local health workers, starting from 10 countries. For a long time, JICA has supported to strengthen medical services by updating facilities and equipment at hospitals, while investing in capacity development of health professionals. In Asia, JICA, together with a Japanese drug maker, has worked to strengthen local vaccine production capacity. Based on the strengthened capacity, Vietnam's Center for Research and Production on Vaccines Biologicals, called Polyvac, is now trying to develop its domestic COVID-19 vaccine. How about Japan? In Japan, several pharmaceutical companies are also trying to speed up vaccine development, while the country is still relies entirely on imported vaccines. JICA keeps communicating with those Japanese pharmaceutical companies to explore any possibility of jointly promoting large-scale clinical trials and vaccine productions in developing countries. Well, let me stop here to save time for Dr. Nakayama's lecture and discussions among participants. Thank you for your attention. Over to you, Makimoto-san.
Thank you, Fukuhara-san, for giving an overview of JICA's cooperation related to COVID-19 and the COVID-19 vaccines. And now, it's with pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Nakayama Tetsuo, Project Professor at the Kitasato University of Murase Satoshi Memorial Institute. Dr. Nakayama is an expert on virology and vaccinology, but also works as general pediatrician. We are so glad you could be here today to share your insights on COVID-19 vaccines. Welcome, Dr. Nakayama. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for your introductions. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm Dr. Nakayama at Kitasato University. Today's topic is to realize the unknown about the COVID vaccines. So 3 items: infection mechanisms of SARS-CoV-2, and now nucleotide-based vaccines and its characteristics I will explain. And the most important things is the vaccine efficacy and vaccine adverse events. So self-introduction. I'm pediatrician. I was born in 1950. I graduated from School of Medicine, Keio University in 1976. I took a pediatric training course for 2 years. And then we worked as a pediatrician for 15 years. I moved to the Kitasato Institute to the Department of Biology. In 1992, I worked as director of Kitasato Institute for Life Science. After we quit the job, I am now going with experiment. My main interest is measles and rubella and RSV and SARS coronavirus. So here we show surveillance data and action for the infection of the controls. We have now 913,000 cases and 50,000 cases are deceased. It's just the end of July. In the worldwide number of patients is 197 million patients and 4 million were deceased. And we have now, we have 4 infection waves, and now in the 5th waves. We are now under the declaration of the emergency the 4th time. So this is the topics of time lag between the vaccine and pathogen identification and the vaccine development. Rabies and smallpox vaccines are developed before the identification of the pathogens. Most of the bacterial pathogens were identified at middle of the 19th centuries. And vaccine development, it took nearly 50 over 100 years. Most virus and pathogens are identified after 1950s, and then vaccines were developed. And COVID-19 vaccines were developed soon after the identification of the pathogens. So here we show the schematic model of the SARS-CoV-2 models. The outer layer is surrounding the spike proteins. Coronavirus were detected in most various animals. Origin of the CoV-2 was emerged 8,000 BC, and it is differentiated to alpha, beta, and gamma delta, 4 kinds of the coronavirus subspecies, and at 3,000 BC. For the human pathogens, the human coronavirus as a pathogen of the common cold was identified in 1964. Most of the animal diseases, for example, feline infectious peritonitis, the first place is cause of the death of the kitten, and transmissible gastroenteritis of the swine diarrheas. The outer layers of the spike antigen is the most important antigen for the protections. So it looks like a corona and crowns. So names is originated from this shape of the coronavirus. So coronavirus is aerosol infections. Large droplet was infected upper respiratory tract, and very small aerosol, less than 5 micrometer, reached to the alveoles and caused pneumonia. But the vaccine induced IgG antibodies in bloodstream, not in respiratory tracts. Recently, it was reported that IgA antibodies were detected in respiratory tract after vaccination with messenger RNA vaccines. So it will be effective, even though it was intramuscular immunizations. Here we show the platforms of vaccine development. There are 2 categories. One is the live vaccines and inactivated vaccines. The most conventional live vaccines are measles, rubella, and mumps. It was established by propagated through animal cells, and BCG and rotavirus is not a human pathogen. It's originated from the calves. And the virus vectors vaccine, there is 2 categories, non-replicative vector and replicative virus vectors. And we are now using adenovirus for the non-replicating vector for COVID-19 vaccines. Replicating viral vector is not used, but we have a long history of the modified vaccinia virus anchor strains and the measles and the parainfluenza. As for the inactivated vaccines with or without adjuvant, the main conventional inactivated vaccine is a 4 billion inactivated vaccine, such as Japanese encephalitis vaccine or hepatitis A vaccine. Sub-unit vaccines are influenza and purified proteins, hepatitis B or HPV vaccines. As a new platform is a DNA and messenger RNA vaccines with lipid nanoparticles. So here we show the emerging diseases. After 2000, we have a lot of emerging and re-emerging diseases. 2002, we have SARS and West Nile, chikungunya, and Marburg. 2004, we have H1N1 pandemic, 2009. And here we show the Ebola virus. And Ebola virus here and JICA 2015. And COVID-19 is 2019. So most of these kind of emerging diseases have high fatalities, such as Ebola virus and extremely high fatalities, more than 75%. So these kind of emerging and re-emerging disease, those people are expected to these kind of vaccines, what promotes the health. And in Japan, dengue virus and H1N1 is landed in Japan, only 2 viruses. As for the vaccines for dengue virus, dengue vaccine was developed by the recombinant vaccine to yellow fever vaccines. But it was developed and mostly used in the Philippines, but severe adverse events were occurred after immunization. They catch dengue virus. So characteristic of the characteristic of the 3 vaccine platforms: live attenuated vaccines, so three types of the conventional vaccines: live attenuated vaccines, and whole virus inactivated vaccine, and purified protein vaccines. These 3 are long history of clinical use. Live attenuated vaccine induce cell-mediated immunity and high antibody levels and long duration of immunity, but adverse events are inevitable because live vaccine is a growth in the bodies. So it induces a long time to develop antibodies or immune response. All virus inactivated or purified proteins only induce high antibodies response and short duration of the immunity. So they require multiple immunization. So today's new types of the gene-based vaccine, they induce cell-mediated immunity and high antibody levels. Its most merit is a rapid development and rapid productions, but no experience of large clinical experience. So back to the central dogma of the proteins and messenger RNA and DNAs. Central dogma is a DNA is a transcribed messenger RNA, and messenger RNA go to the cytoplasm and protein is translated from the messenger RNA in the cytoplasm. The protein is essential to maintain the physiological event in human lives, and genetic information is encoded in the DNA. DNA and messenger RNA in the protein is a central dogma of molecular biology. So back to the high school biologists. Viral game, there are two kinds of the viruses, RNA virus and the DNA virus. What is the difference between the RNA and DNA? Here we show the deoxygens is a deoxynucleotide. Deletion of oxygen at the low, at the red rows. At the AT and GC and binding is a hydrogen bond, and the elongation of the nucleic acid is a phosphorylation bindings. The triplet of the ACGT determines the 220 essential amino acids. The protein is synthesized along with the extension of amino acids. ATG is a start codon, and TAG and TAA is a stop, as they are stop codons, the termination of the signals. This information is a DNA, messenger RNA, and proteins. This is a schematic image of the COVID-19 vaccines. These three are new gene-based vaccines, messenger RNA in internalized in the lipid nanoparticles, and the DNA vaccines. Initially, spike proteins are spike proteins are amplified by PCR from the clinical samples. And then this DNA is inserted into the expression plasmid, and it was used as a DNA vaccine. Messenger RNA is transcribed from DNA, and messenger RNA is fragile. Then lipid nanoprotein is encoded into this messenger RNA. And the chimpanzee adenovirus vector is a DNA segment is inserted to the DNA, adenovirus DNA. And conventional two kinds of the vaccine, 4 billion inactivated vaccine, is from the virus cultures, from cell culture and purified, and then inactivated with formaldehyde. Then structure of the surface of the spike protein is changed. And the purified protein is cultured from the insect cells infected with a baculovirus carrying spike protein genes, and produce a lot of proteins, spike proteins, and with adjuvant. So these are COVID-19 vaccines, messenger RNA, DNA, and virus vector, and 4 billion inactivated and purified proteins. So, right. Sorry. So I explained the immune response by new vaccines, DNA and messenger RNA, and virus vector vaccines. DNA vaccine should enter the cell nucleus, and the nuclear DNA transcribed to messenger RNA to cytoplasm and produce proteins. And virus vector vaccines and infected to the cell, and DNA moved to the nucleus, and messenger RNA in the cytoplasm. And messenger RNA and included in the lipid nanoparticles. So the cell captured, and DNA and messenger RNA are captured in the cells, and naked type of the RNA proteins produced from this kind of the messenger RNA. And also this type of the RNA is a strong activator of the innate immunity. So it activated the toll-like receptors 3, 7, and 8, and induce interferon alpha beta. And alpha beta activates the CD8 cells and its cytotoxic T cells, CTL cells. And also this messenger RNA strong activator of the inflammasome. And it produces IL-6, IL-beta, and TNF alpha. These inflammatory cytokines activated CD4 cells. It acts as a helper cell to produce antibodies. So what is the difference among three vaccines? Briefly, DNA vaccine into the nucleus, and DNA is transcribed to the messenger RNA to move to the cytoplasm. And the messenger RNA vaccines are captured in the cells and cell cytoplasm. And virus vector vaccines were infected to the cells, and DNA moved to the nucleus, and then messenger RNA is transcribed and translated messenger RNA in the cytoplasm. All three types of the new vaccine is the same action. And finally, messenger RNA in the cytoplasm. It produces proteins and it activates innate immunity and induces a strong immune response. What is the pathogenesis of the serious pneumonia? Large droplet is trapped in upper respiratory tract, but small particle, there is a small particle reaches to the alveolars. Alveolar cells infect COVID-19 virus, and then infection in alveolar cell, the destruction of the alveolar structures, it damages the O2 and CO2 exchange. It causes the respiratory distress syndrome. And COVID-19 SARS coronavirus infect alveolar macrophages, and they produce the production of the inflammatory cytokines, IL-6, TNF alpha, and IL-beta. It causes the cytokine storms in the systemic illness. The virus particle bind the destruction of the alveolar structures. The SARS virus go to the vessels, blood vessels, and SARS coronavirus bind to the ACE2 expressed on the endothelial cells. This causes thrombosis in the alveolar and respiratory organs. So there is a serious illness. We are afraid of the antibody-dependent enhancement, ADE. ADE is a binding up antibodies without neutralizing antibodies, only bind with the virus. And there is no activity of the neutralizing activity, and virus were internalized of the cells, and the increase, virus were increased, and then induce many kinds of the cytokines, TNF alpha, IL-1 beta, IL-6, and enhance the production of the cytokine. It causes a cytokine storm. It is one reason of the serious illness of the COVID-19 infections. Here's a brief summary of the laboratory examination. The diagnosis of the infection is very important. But there is three ways of the detection of antibodies and detection of antigens and PCR. Detection of antigens and antigens become positive when virus particles are present in 10 to 3 powered or 4 powered virus particles. That means an infectious level of the virus particles are present in the samples. It's become positive for the detection of antigen. But PCR is very sensitive. It becomes positive when 10 or 100 copies are present, even in the dead virus, dead cell debris. So please remember this level of the sensitivity of the antigen detection on the PCR. So it is a schematic model of messenger RNAs. The messenger RNA is here in a level of the lipid nanoparticle, outer level of the surrounded by the polyethylene glycol. This is a scheme of the messenger RNAs. But 5' we have a capping enzyme, and 5'UTR and 3'UTR. It's a stabilization of the messenger RNAs. And we have an NS1, NSP2, NSP3, NSP4. It is a replicative unit. So we have used this kind of unit is a replicative messenger RNAs. So CAP is a synthesis of the transportation systems, and the 5' and 3'UTR, the stable messenger RNAs, and codon optimization and modification of the origins. It's reduction of the recognition of toll-like receptors. This modified origin is reduced interferon alpha beta activities. It becomes a safety of the vaccines. S-protein mutations, amino acid mutations, fluorine at 986 and 7 positions. It's a stable prefusion structures. The cell amplifying messenger RNA is here, and messenger RNA is a 13 years basic research is packed in the messenger RNA vaccines. So here shows a messenger RNA chronologies. Messenger RNA is discovered in 1961. The important findings are background of the orange colors, especially the cationic lipid mediated by messenger RNA deliveries. It was developed in 1989. After that, the protein expression also examined by the messenger RNA using this cationic lipid deliveries in the mouse models. In the 2000, after 2000, we have a lot of findings of the toll-like receptor activities. It's the innate immunities. So turning point of the messenger RNA is 2013. Is a clinical trial of the rabies vaccine. It's a success, but it's a turning point of the big pharma. Quit, go on or not. Most of big pharmacy stop developing this kind of the messenger RNA vaccines. All Moderna and CureVac continue to develop vaccines against influenza and RSV. Here we show the timeline of Moderna messenger RNA development. The SARS-CoV-2 was identified. COVID-19 is end of 2019, and January 10th, the full length of sequence were opened, and then even after 3 days after the sequence, they developed the vaccine design. Only 3 days. And then they tried to experiment of the small animals. And then they applied the clinical trial February 20th, only just 40 days after the sequence, after the identification of the sequence, they developed the vaccines and application only 40 days. That means a warp speed. And then a clinical trial started March 16th. And this shows the chronology of the virus vectors vaccines. There is two kinds of the virus vector, proliferative vaccine vectors and non-proliferative vaccine vectors. So it was initiated in the 1960s. It started with the modified vaccinia virus anchor strains. And a lot of virus antigens were inserted into the MVA, and this kind of experiment in only mouse models. After 1990s and nearly 2000, it was started for the clinical trials using malaria and H5N1 and Ebola viruses. So MVA system, it's in the human growth in the human bodies. The problem is the MVA and the measles vaccine is already immunized in the older aged people. So there is no vaccines, no virus vaccines for MVA and measles. Then move to the non-proliferative vectors. Retrovirus vector and adenovirus vectors. Retrovirus vector they are initially used for the gene therapies, transfer the defective gene to the cells, and lentivirus for the ADA deficiency, ex vivo gene therapies, and most in Japan, antivirus vectors. And the adenovirus vector initially tried on the patient with cystic fibrosis, but it failed. And then moved to the transcarbamylase deficiencies. Then in 1999, Gelsinger accident. Gelsinger is a 19 years old male. They are suffering an ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency. He was treated with adenovirus vector carrying ornithine transcarbamylase genes, and then it stops for the development of these adenovirus vectors, and also 2003 leukemia in the patient with ADA deficiency treated with lentivirus vectors. And so several years, this kind of the virus vectors was stopped. And then Oxford tried to continue to this kind of the vaccines. How about the following after immunization? So this kind of the vaccine were intramuscularly administered, and it's infected into the muscle cells, and vaccines are inoculated into the muscle cells and produce the spike proteins. And this kind of messenger RNA is trapped in the dendritic cells and macrophages, and then carried to the regional lymph node. And then regional lymph node immune response will be occurred. Mostly regional lymphocytes. And the axillary lymph node, they are place of the immunization and immune response phase. And in the injection site, it causes an inflammatory response. causing IL-6 and TNF-alpha and IL-1 beta. It's a inflammatory cytokines. It is related to the local pain. And the regional lymphocyte, lymph node, they produce many kinds of the cytokines. It is a systemic adverse reactions. So there is a many unknown COVID-19 vaccines. Persistence of the immunities. Vaccine prevent serious disease, but not infections. Application for pregnant women, school-aged children. How was the mutations? How did the clinical trial perform? Vaccine adverse event, anaphylaxis, thrombosis, cardiomyopathy, and ADN, and death. And there is a lot of groundless rumors. The COVID-19 is a serious pregnant women, but no influence on the fetus. Among 58 cases of the COVID-19 in pregnant women, 40 were infected before the second trimesters. 3 had the oxygen therapy during the course of the infections. Remaining 80 were infected during the third trimester. Among them, 38.9% had oxygen therapy, and 1 assisted with respiratory respirators and passed away. There was tendency of the increased number of the premature births, but no influence on the fetus. So immunization for the pregnant women, immunization is not recommended because the paucity of the clinical data. The medical associations of obstetrics and gynecological announced pregnant women are not excluded from vaccination. When immunized, please explain a long-term safety issue because the paucity of the evidence and obtains consent and refrain from immunization until 12 weeks of the pregnancy. Please check the fetal heartbeat. Also, it was immunized in the United States in 827 pregnant women were immunized. No increase in the incidence of the abortion, low birth weight babies, and congenital malformation and fetal death was not noted. So immunological feature during pregnancy. The protection of pregnant women and themselves and the fetus from infectious diseases. During pregnancy, decreased level of cell-mediated immunity and neutrophil functions during first trimester. No influence on the antibody response. In rare case of the serious adverse events are observed, but not increasing compared with the healthy subject. But live vaccines are prohibited, but not inactivated vaccines. So this is this shows the current status of the COVID-19 infection and death. Here shows the number of infections. The very high level of the number of the patients were 20 years or 30 years. Here shows the death, number of the deaths, only about 70 or 80 years of age. Most of the infection is 20 or 40 years of age. There are few cases of serious diseases, but proportionally, increasing number of the infection, but serious number of the serious cases will be increased. But several cases with sensory loss of smell and taste, prolonged cough, respiratory distress, fatigue, alopecia were noted as a rate complication after infections. To cope with the immunization with children. So before moving on the topics and number of the COVID-19 infection deaths in different age groups, and each 10 years groups, infection per million, that's the highest 20 years of age, almost 40,000 infection per millions. And death of the COVID-19 infection is highest over 80 years of age, over around 700 per million. Even after the deaths after immunizations, vaccinations per million, overall incidence is 17.3 deaths per million. To compare this death rate of the COVID-19 infection and vaccination, it is very effective for the prevention of the deaths over elderlies. But for the young generations, we have some experience of the infection of the vaccine recipient. This is a breakthrough infection. That means the breakthrough infection is the 5,157 million, the incidence of 33 per million. That is an incidence of the breakthrough infection. Also, it is effective to prevent infections. So the clinical trial of the messenger RNA in the 12 of the 15 school-aged children compared with high school children. And there is a result of the instance in the Japanese trials. The vaccine seems to be safe and effective, but pediatric generation is less infectious with very mild, or even if they infected, they cause a very mild illness. We have limited data on the immunization in young teenagers, and we have a more cautious attitude. But there is the local pains, 80%, and fever, 20%, fatigue and headaches and muscle pains. So how did the clinical trials of Pfizer messenger RNA vaccines and the vaccination groups and control groups are randomly enrolled and then take a course of the infections. Event-based studies, 100 cases with COVID-19, its clinical trial was stopped, and control groups, 162 patients. Among them, vaccine groups, only 8. That means the vaccine efficacy is a vaccine group with 8 patients, and control group, 162 patients. Vaccine efficacy is 96%. The infection rate of the vaccines here, infection rate of the control here, the risk ratio is 20. If we say vaccine efficacy is 95%, it is not 95% of the vaccine recipient can protect the infection, not among 160 COVID-19 patients here. Among them, 95% of 155 were not infected, even if they were immunized. So it is different, quite different. The vaccine efficacy is like this. Then how the vaccine induce specific immune response? The vaccine is prevent infection, onset of the illness, and serious disease through host immune response. Immune response is a host defense mechanism against pathogens, causing it induce specific antibodies and cell-mediated immunities. Antibodies act as a toxin, as a neutralizing activities, and cell-mediated immunities damage the infected cell was eliminated. The helper function to produce antibodies, then they are coordinated to induce immunization immune memories. So innate immunities, they recognize the molecular patterns, and the pumps and pathogen-associated molecular patterns recognize the pathogens, and that damage-associated molecular patterns, it's a sensor of the dangerous signals. So it's a signals an inflammasome and produce inflammatory cytokines, and produce many kinds of cytokines. And interferon alpha beta, it activates cytotoxic T cells, expansion of the infections, prevents the infections. And inflammatory cytokines produce antibodies. They coordinate include immunization, immunological memories. So people believe that the adverse reaction is a different phenomenon of the acquired immunities. This is not the case. The vaccination, it causes inflammations, injection site, GCSF and IL-6 and neutrophils and many kinds of the inflammatory cells are accumulated in the injection site and inflammation occurs. And these kinds of the inflammatory cytokines are produced. And this is stimulates the innate immunity, and then also the pumps produce the interferon alpha, beta, and inflammatory cytokines. It induces acquired immunities. And that this kind of the phenomenon is acquired immunity, but in the different point of view, it is adverse reactions. So vaccine adverse event is a main, vaccine effect is a main reactions produce a protection, infection, and the onset of the illness and seriousness. Vaccine adverse reaction is an undesirable event following vaccination, being scientifically related to the vaccinations. Vaccine adverse event is undesirable event following vaccination. The causal relation to the vaccination is not scientifically uncertain. They are reported as a questionable adverse reaction. In Japan, they are included in the suspected vaccine adverse reactions. The safety profile of the common adverse reactions, the clinical trials in Japan, Pfizer and Moderna, and the Japanese trials conducted around 120 or 150. The local reaction, local pain is over 80%, and fatigue 40 to 60, and muscle pains and headaches 40 to 60%, and chills and fevers 30 or 40% of the recipient. This is the quite focused on the anaphylaxis. Diagnosis of the anaphylaxis based on the Brighton criterion. Anaphylaxis has three characteristics of abrupt onset and rapid progress, and including two or more symptoms relating many multiple organs. We should care the differential diagnosis. Immunization stress-related response, ISRR. Immunization, before immunization, people are very nervous and high tensions, causing this kind of the adverse reactions, activation of the symptomatic nerves, tachycardia, tachycardia, and the shortness of breathing, and the parasympathetic nerves and the vagal reflex, the bradycardia, hypotension. These are differentiated from the anaphylaxis. So incidence of the anaphylaxis reported by the bears, the Pfizer and Moderna, it causes 5.0 per million Pfizer, and Moderna causes 2.8 anaphylaxis. In Japan, incidence of anaphylaxis in Japan is 7 per million doses. And cardiomyopathy was also discussed on the messenger RNA vaccines. It's also caused the systemic reaction of the cytokine reaction, cytokines. The Pfizer and Moderna, and in Japan, there is rare cases 1 or 0.5 or 1 million, and the USA 4.1, England 2.1 and 1.1, and this kind was 3.6 or so, the carditis. And the EU, totally EU and carditis 0.1, especially totally around 1 to 5 cardiomyopathy per millions. And also discussed the thrombosis. After immunization of the AstraZeneca vaccines, the spike proteins are bound in the ACA2 expressed on the platelet and activated by the platelet factor 4 release, and then spike proteins, the bloodstreams bind the ACA2 expressed on the endothelial cell. It causes damage and the inflammation. And glycopeptide proteoglycan is bind platelet factor 4 beta complex, and they cause an antibody of this complex, and the antibodies to this complex bind to the platelet FC receptors. It causes platelet activation and thrombocytopenia. It is a mechanism of the thrombosis of the spike proteins. So thrombosis is reported after immunization with AstraZeneca vaccines. With incidence of 6.5 cases per million doses. Otherwise, 35 cases with thrombosis was reported following 55 million subjects. Very rare in the Pfizer's messenger RNAs. So adverse reactions and deaths after vaccination in Japan, its incidence is 17.3 per million. United States and England 18 and 15 point per millions. In comparison, the conventional vaccines, 23 variant PPSP, it causes 3.2 death case per millions, and also influenza vaccine 0.2 case of death per millions. So this kind of messenger RNA COVID-19 vaccines cause a high rate of the death, but it is due to the systemic activation of the innate immunities. It causes a very higher level of cytokines. It is so number of the COVID-19 infant and death. So I will show the previously is the infection rate is 20 to 29 years of age, and death rate is the highest in the older age. The overall incidence is 70.3, but we should examine this each generations was a death rate was per millions. Total overall incidence is 70.3. But vaccines prevent death in all elderlies. But as for the younger generations, it focuses to prevent or not. The infections vaccination, the breakthrough vaccines, there are 33 million in the United States. The recently Pfizer announced the vaccine efficacy is 96.2 and decreased 6% per 2 months, every 2 months. And then at 2 months after immunization, it decreased 90% efficacy. And then 4 to 6 months after immunization, decreased 83.7 efficacies. It is among 42,000 participants. This kind of the number will be decreased in a year after immunization. So another point of the breakthrough is mutations. The vaccine COVID-19 SARS coronavirus infects cell to cell during these infections. RNA change, these changes were increased, and then transmitted to the humans, and during the infection process, convalescent plasma therapy was employed, and then escaped mutant emerging after plasma therapy and increased vaccinations. And mutation means a change of the amino acid of the RNAs. This kind of change are increasing. So finally, well-proliferative strain survives among the variety of the mutant strains. That is, the Delta strain is a higher effectivities compared with previous variant. So first variant is England strains and Alpha variant, and South Africa Beta and Brazil type like Gamma. Now India strains are Delta. There is a lot of mutations in the RNA. So here we show we are now examining the persistence of antibodies or the persistence of the immunities. However, the different antigenicity of the mutated strains. TN is obtains the blood 1 week after the second dose and 1 month after the second dose. So Wuhan strains neutralizing antibodies initially 32, but decreased to 4. 1 week after the second dose, neutralizing antibodies against Wuhan 32. European strains, it was prevalent strains, and last year's 32. Against Alpha strain, decreased 16, against Beta variant 4, and Gamma variant 4, decreased to the new mutated strains. The California strains nearly the Delta strains. So blue highlighted persons, they had no adverse reactions after vaccination. They produce relatively lower antibodies against Wuhan, and they reduced antibodies against several Alpha, Beta, and Gamma strains. But from 6 to 11 recipients, they obtained 1 month after the second dose. They have a high titer of the antibodies against Wuhan strains. If after immunization with the vaccines, high level of the antibodies, there is no decrease against the mutated strains. They are showing the high level of antibodies against Wuhan, EU strains, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and Delta-like strains. So the bottom person is had a natural infection, and the additional immunization 1 month after the first dose. They produce very high level of the antibodies against all kinds of the variant. So lower titers of anti-antibodies against Wuhan is less cross-reactivity against the mutated strains. And then we are now going to the examining cell-mediated immunities. TN is here. Whole blood cells are cultured for 24 hours, stimulated with receptor binding domain and spike proteins. Higher cytokine production is in response to the spike proteins. And dark column is number 9. There's spike proteins, high level of this kind of cytokines. So here shows TH2 cytokines, IL-4, IL-5, IL-10. Number 5 recipient, high level of IL-4 and IL-5 TH2 cytokines. TN and a low level of TH2 cytokines. So cell-mediated immune response with spike proteins. We are examined this recipient. Interferon gamma and IL-2 is TH1 cytokines. They produce this kind of TH1 cytokines in response to spike proteins 3 months after immunization. TN is reduced 3 months after the immunization. This TN is PT person is me. My antibody and cellular immunity decreased 3 months after the 2 dose. In the general times, why did the mothers take their kids to the small vaccinations? And science is to proper understanding. Now, COVID-19 is a high mortality, morbidity rate is 0.58%, and the mortality rate is nearly 1.8%. And the difficulty in breath and fatigue and disorder of the sense of smell and taste as a complication, even in the young infant, if infected. Vaccine adverse events are extremely rare, but occurred. Vaccination effect is over 90%, but decreased against mutant strains. The kanji of the vaccine is a white goat. Then maybe this kind of the vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine, become white goat vaccines. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nakayama, for your very clear and detailed explanation. We learned a lot about COVID-19 vaccine and the virus itself. Okay, next we would like to move to the Q&A session, but we have only 20 minutes, so but there are a lot of questions to us. So I'd like to extend the webinar 10 minutes. And so 25 or nearly 30 minutes Q&A session we'd like to have. Okay. So let me invite Dr. Isono Mitsuo for the moderator, as a moderator. So floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all of the participants for your active participation to this webinar. We had a lot of questions in advance, and also we received a lot of questions during this lecture. So we are very sorry, but we cannot answer to all of the questions, and we would like to pick up some of the proposed questions. So at first, I'd like to thank Professor Nakayama for your very excellent lecture on the mechanisms and effectiveness and side effects of the COVID-19 vaccine. So there are a lot of detailed explanation, but at first, as an overall, many participants have interest. So there are several types of vaccines. So at this moment, what kind of type of vaccine is the most effective for COVID-19? That is the first question. Is this okay?
And principally, the efficacy is nearly the same. The messenger RNAs and DNA and virus vector vaccines. And then there is several steps to make the messenger RNA in the cytoplasm. Messenger RNA is directly encapsulated and trapped in the cytoplasm. And DNA vaccine is 1-2 steps in the nucleus and transcribed and into the cytoplasm. And virus vector vaccine is 1 step is an infection to the cells, and the genes and DNA go to the nucleus and then transcribe to the messenger RNA. The immune response is a messenger RNA. All 3 kinds of the vaccine is the same immunological response. But there are several steps influenced by the vaccine efficacies. And as a result of the phase 3 clinical trials, the messenger RNA is the most higher vaccine efficacies. And the next is nearly the same, around 60 or 70 or 90%. And the virus vaccine vector is different from country to countries. It depends on the pre-immunization status.
Okay, thank you very much. And how about these side effects? So is there any differences of the severity of the side effect among each type of vaccine, or also that will be the same?
This kind of gene-based vaccines have the same mechanism of to stimulate the innate immunities. The level of the stimulation of the innate immunity is the highest and in the messenger RNA vaccines. And next is virus vector vaccines. This kind of the release of the cytokine is closely related to the occurrence of the clinical adverse reactions. As conventional vaccines, as a whole virion inactivated vaccine is more less adverse reactions, but less efficacies. That means immune response of the difference in the immune response. The whole virion inactivated vaccine cannot grow in the human bodies. Only stimulates the level of the messenger RNA in the whole virions. Only RNA in the virion can stimulate the innate immunities. That means lower level of adverse reaction, higher level of the safety, and lower level of the efficacies.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next question is regarding the variant. So just you showed the several slides explaining the effectiveness against the variant. So as overall, so most of all the vaccines are still effective for most of the variant. Is this right?
Yes.
So then which type of the vaccine is the most effective for variant? Is there any differences?
We have no data about this kind of difference between the vaccines against many kinds of the variants. So we have only 1 year after the initiation of the messenger RNAs. So Pfizer announced only 6 months efficacies. That means vaccine efficacy decreased 6% every 2 months. That means this kind of the vaccines reduction of the antibody levels and cell-mediated immunity will be decreased 1 or 1.5 years after the immunization. Maybe after 1 or 2 years later, we will require additional immunization with different kinds of the mutant strains will be necessary.
Okay, thank you very much. So also regarding the variant, so we are very lucky that we do not have the variant which may affect the effect of the vaccine at this moment. But is there any possibility that the strong variant will happen to affect the effectiveness of the current vaccines?
Yes, and there are several kinds of the variety of the mutants. We have now explained the alpha, beta, gamma, delta, and there is a lot of variant in the and that's reported in the WHO. These kind of the variants were not characterized, but as a rule of the vaccine viruses become infected in the many peoples during the infections. Maybe mutation will be added, and then hypermutated variant will be emerging. But this kind of the type of the variant shows very high infectivity, but less pathogenic. that will become like influenza and or original common cold alpha beta coronaviruses. Mutation become more higher. Maybe infectivity of increase, but pathogenicity decrease.
Okay, thank you very much. So here there are a lot of questions regarding the details of the vaccination. So first question is, how long will immunity continue after full dose of vaccination? Or should we receive vaccine in every year, like influenza?
Maybe the messenger RNA and vector vaccine is character is inactivated vaccines. Its act induce antibodies and cell-mediated immunity, but this immunity will decrease in a year or so. But I should know when this from when we will require the additional dose of like influenza every year. But I don't know when it will be as influenza viruses.
Okay, thank you very much. So, so next question regarding the doses of the vaccine. So at this moment, only vaccine by Johnson & Johnson needs to inject it only one time. Other vaccines needs 2 doses of the injections. Why there are these differences?
I don't know what, and Johnson & Johnson is a single dose, and the AstraZeneca 2 dose. But even AstraZeneca 1 dose is still effective, but 2 doses is higher efficacies. Maybe Johnson & Johnson will be more higher efficacy with additional second dose. But background of the virus vector is quite different. Johnson & Johnson using adeno26, AstraZeneca using chimpanzee adenovirus. Maybe this kind of the backbone of the virus vector is different. It will be influence this kind of efficacy, single dose or second required 2 doses. But I think Johnson & Johnson, but 2 doses will be better. I think 1 dose is only higher level of the antibody, but increased level of the antibody, but decreased more promptly, I think. But I don't know. But 2 doses is much better, I think.
Thank you very much. So next is the duration between the first dose and second dose. So in some case, the duration between the first dose and second dose of the vaccination is 3 weeks, and some cases in 4 weeks. Or recently, I understand that there is some research that the vaccine is still effective even after the 12 weeks of the first dose. So what are the conditions to define this duration of the first and second dose of the vaccinations?
And Pfizer vaccine is 3 weeks intervals. The Moderna has 4 weeks intervals. Maybe there is no differences between the 2. Maybe the vaccine development is so enhanced speed, but there's no time to compare these kinds of first and second intervals. So I think these 2 vaccine messenger RNAs, 2 doses, even after 1 dose is effective, that's around 60%. In the nature of this vaccine, messenger RNA, we showed that this type of the vaccine stimulates innate immunity, and then it's memorized the immune stimulations. And so in the second dose, it is a high level of the antibodies. That means in the first immunization, it's develops the priming of the immunizations. So 3 weeks and 4 weeks is not different between the two vaccines. But important point is surely have a second dose. And they say even after the 12 years, 12 months, 12 weeks or so, it is quite effective. Important matter is surely have a second dose. Maybe one dose is cause a priming of the immune response, but second dose and the enhanced response and prolonged immunity causing the second dose.
Okay, thank you very much. So now I think there are some research or discussion of the necessity of the third dose of the vaccination. Actually, I understand in Israel, they started to provide the third times or third dose vaccinations. So what is your opinion for this third dose vaccination? Is it really necessary?
It is quite different from country to countries. Israel have a higher vaccination coverage, over 60 or 70%. And then, even though they have a lot of cases of the infections causing Delta strains, but in Japan, the vaccine coverage, the second dose is around 30%, and the single dose vaccine coverage is around 40%. And the infection cases, the most is the young infant, young adult who have not immunized. So important point is Japan is more prevalent of the second dose immunizations. After that, we should discuss the third dose booster immunization. This situation is different from country to countries. In Japan, increased more vaccination coverage, and several countries in the Southeast Asia and Africa. The important point is increased coverage of the first and second vaccine coverage. After that, we should discuss the third immunization using new variant also.
Thank you very much. So for the third dose, it's depending on the country situation, and we have to see what will happen after the second dose vaccination finished. Thank you very much. So next question is the mixed use of the vaccination vaccine. So recently there is some research in which two different types of vaccine will be used. For example, first time AstraZeneca is used, and Pfizer or Moderna is used in as the second dose. Are they really effective or some problems? What is your opinion?
Initially, there's several problems using the same brand. But recently, we have discussed about the different brand of the first and second doses. Today, I explained the mechanism of the immunization, and they are only the same immune response relating to the messenger RNA in the cytoplasm. It produces proteins and stimulates innate immunities. So mechanism is quite the same. So I think there is no problem. The first and second vaccine is a different brand, but it is important to have an interval to take 3 or 4 weeks as the interval. As an example, for the Sputnik's, the Sputnik's 5 is a different backbone of the adenoviruses. Initially, adenovirus 26, the second was adeno5. So there is a different kind of virus vaccines. So I think there is no problem with the different brand of the first and second dose because the mechanism is the same.
Thank you very much. Also, it is said that to use the two different type of vaccine can reduce the incidence of the severe adverse effect. Is this correct?
But I have no data. And maybe this kind of to discuss this kind of the efficacy and the adverse reaction, we should have a clinical trials. And then after that, we should explain this difference between the different combination of the different brands. So we should take many types of the clinical trial to combine different brands. So it is difficult to do so. Maybe vaccine usage is very limited. So first dose is vectored vaccine. The second dose is messenger RNA. And there is a type of the vaccines, not a brand. The first dose is a vectored vaccine. Second dose is a messenger vaccines. So this kind of clinical trials should be performed.
Okay, thank you very much. So the next question is regarding the breakthrough infection. So in your slide, you show that even a small number or incidents, there are some cases with a breakthrough infection. That means the person can be affected after the full dose of immunization. I think the incidence was 33 per 1 million. So it's a very small number, but are there any special conditions for those individuals who get infected after the full immunization? For example, they have a comorbidity with some serious disease or something.
The breakthrough instance of the United States shows in today's slide 33 cases per million. But I think this number is very small, I think, because infection of the COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 showing COVID-19, but symptoms is quite different, variety of the symptoms from asymptomatic to mild and moderate diseases. And they say the symptoms appear only 33 per million. But asymptomatic breakthrough is more higher level of the instance. So in Japan, we have a lot of breakthrough infections causing Delta variant. It depends on the variant strains and persistence of the immunity with the host. The second two-dose immunization, we are now examining the antibodies persistence and cell-mediated immunities. And the older people have a lower levels of antibodies. And today I show in the slide TN, the very low level of antibody, it's me. So this kind of the older people have a lower antibody levels. So level of the antibody will decrease. But we have cell-mediated immunity, the immune memories, but still effective. And the two-dose immunization have the reduced symptoms. That's breakthrough infection showing the symptoms, but asymptomatic breakthrough is much higher than 33 per million. I think it is difficult to count this kind of symptomatic breakthrough is very difficult. So symptomatic breakthrough is 33, but I think more higher instance, I think.
Thank you very much. So, so next point is the already infected cases. So, so the people who already infected with COVID-19, do they need a vaccination, or they don't need to consider at all?
So I examine the natural infections. One dose of the vaccines and examines the antibody levels. So the level of the antibody is quite different from the symptoms, asymptomatic and very low, very mild illness, causing a very low level of antibodies. Thus, a patient with a severe infection showing the high level of antibodies and strong immunities. But I have no data of the persistence of the COVID-19 infections. Maybe this type of very mild illness, very low level of antibody. I think these patients will be required of the additional one dose of the immunization. It is better to have a good immunity.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe this will be the last question. Still, we have a lot of questions, but we are very sorry, the time is running. So the last question is for the vaccination for the children. So how can we apply vaccine to the children? So if we want to apply to children, we need a special clinical trial, or considering the current situation, infection situation among the children, we don't need to think about the vaccinating the children at this moment. What is your opinion?
Yes, and the Moderna and the Pfizer and the clinical trial was an infant 12 to 15. But in Japan, there is no clinical trials, and they are allowed to use vaccines in young children at school age and middle school age children. But I think this type of messenger RNA stimulated innate immunities. So we have no lot of data. We have not a lot of data. This kind of this young infant, as we have very troublesome about HPV vaccine was a young adolescent. So we should discuss about this kind of application with a young student. In the pediatric societies announced, we have a lot of data. We have only a small data of the school-aged children. We have more. We have attitudes, more conscious attitudes. But we have not excluded. But people who have the immunization, they want to have an immunization for the young children aged over 12 years of age. We should explain the safety and adverse reactions, and we should discuss about this kind of the safety and adverse reaction with guardians. Then we should immunize. We should take an immunization for this young infant. So we should have a more cautious attitude. They said in the lot of large-scale immunizations, but I think it's a young infant and young school-aged children should be immunized in the private clinics, because the doctor has their own history and on families, and they will have no problems. If they have a large-scale immunization, there is a lot of adverse reactions, and it causes a problem after the HPV vaccines.
Okay, thank you very much. So thank you very much for the very kind and detailed answer to all the questions. So today we learned a lot of important points and for the COVID-19 vaccine. So I hope this will help all the participants to develop the vaccine strategies in your country. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Nakayama, for your excellent presentation and explanation today. So the Q&A session is over, and back to Makimoto-san.
Okay, thank you very much, Isono-san. And thank you very much, Professor Nakayama, for your excellent and valuable Q&A sessions. As Isono-san said, I believe the participants have learned and realized lots of unknowns about COVID-19 vaccine through this webinar. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, may I thank you very much for your participation until over 10 minutes to the time, set time. And I hope you enjoy the program. Before closing, I'd like to have some announcement. We organize this COVID-19 webinar about once a month. Next webinar is around September. We will send email to inform you on the detail if we are ready. Looking forward to your participation next time too. In order to make our programs better, please provide us with your feedback on this webinar. It takes only a few minutes to fill in the feedback survey. So this is the end of the webinar. And I'd like to thank again to Professor Nakayama and Isono-san for the valuable contribution to the webinar. And dear participants, have a safe day and see you next time again. Bye-bye.